The kitchen was warm, alive with the sound of sizzling oil and the familiar rhythm of an ordinary evening. She stood at the stove, calm, focused, wearing the face of a loyal wife. He was only a few steps away when her phone lit up on the counter. One vibration, one message, four words that felt like a quiet execution. I miss you. It wasn't the message alone that shattered him. It was the injustice of it. While he worked longer hours, swallowed exhaustion, and built a life brick by brick, someone else was reaching into his home without knocking. She didn't notice him pick up the phone. She didn't see him type the reply meant for her. Come here. That single choice wasn't anger. It was the beginning of something far bigger, something that would expose lies, test dignity, and demand a price no one expected. Before we step into this story, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you're drawn to intense stories of betrayal, truth, and healing, don't forget to subscribe for more. The kitchen was warm, alive with the sound of sizzling oil and the familiar rhythm of an ordinary evening. She stood at the stove, calm, focused, wearing the face of a loyal wife. He was only a few steps away when her phone lit up on the counter. One vibration, one message, four words that felt like a quiet execution. I miss you. It wasn't the message alone that shattered him. It was the injustice of it. While he worked longer hours, swallowed exhaustion, and built a life brick by brick, someone else was reaching into his home without knocking. She didn't notice him pick up the phone. She didn't see him type the reply meant for her. Come here. That single choice wasn't anger. It was the beginning of something far bigger, something that would expose lies, test dignity, and demand a price no one expected. Before we step into this story, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you're drawn to intense stories of betrayal, truth, and healing, don't forget to subscribe for more. Daniel Moore had never considered himself a dramatic man. He believed in routines, in showing up, in quiet loyalty that didn't need applause. At 38, his life was built on predictability. Early mornings, long commutes, late dinners that often went cold while he finished emails. The house they shared wasn't large, but it was paid for, stable, a symbol of everything he thought he was doing right. And Rachel had been the center of that belief. 6 years of marriage, countless compromises, and an unspoken agreement that loyalty was assumed, not questioned. That evening had begun like so many others. Rachel cooked, Daniel listened. The air smelled like onions and garlic, comfort and normalcy layered together. She hummed a tune he recognized from years ago, back when laughter came easier and silence didn't feel so heavy. He watched her from the counter, noticing how the light caught the curve of her cheek, how familiar she still felt, even as something unnamed had been drifting between them for months. He told himself marriages went through seasons. Distance didn't always mean danger. The phone buzzed again on the counter. Face up, careless. Daniel hadn't meant to look. He wasn't suspicious by nature. But the name on the screen stopped him anyway. Evan Cole. The letters sat there confidently, as if they belonged. The message preview flashed briefly before the screen dimmed. I miss you. Rachel's hand hesitated mid-chop. It was subtle, almost nothing. But Daniel saw it. In that pause, something inside him recalibrated. He felt the room narrow, sounds dulling, his heartbeat slowing in a way that scared him more than panic ever could. He didn't confront her. He didn't ask who Evan was, or why his message sounded intimate enough to bypass explanation. Instead, he reached for the phone with a steadiness that surprised even him. She was still facing the stove when he unlocked it. No password. That alone cut deeper than the message itself. He opened the thread. Scrolling felt like falling down a staircase that had been waiting for him all along. Weeks of casual familiarity, inside jokes, late-night check-ins, compliments that didn't belong to a coworker. Nothing explicit enough to scream guilt, yet intimate enough to whisper it repeatedly. This wasn't an accident. It was a slow permission granted again and again. Daniel's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He thought of the nights he'd come home to an empty couch because she'd already gone to bed. The weekends she'd claimed were for catching up on work. The way she'd begun guarding her phone, turning it face down, carrying it from room to room like a lifeline. He thought of how he'd explained all of it away, blaming stress, blaming himself. "Come here," he typed. 4 words. Calm, direct, final. He hit send and set the phone back exactly where it had been. Rachel turned slightly, eyes flicking toward the counter. "Can you set the table?" she asked, her voice steady but thinner than usual. Daniel nodded. He moved automatically, pulling plates from the cabinet, his mind already miles ahead. Somewhere between the stove and the dining table, a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. He wasn't planning a scene. He was planning the truth. As they ate, Rachel talked about her day. A meeting that ran long, a project deadline, names he recognized, and others he didn't. Daniel responded when expected, nodded when appropriate. Inside, he was cataloging everything, the cadence of her lies, the confidence with which she delivered them. He realized then that betrayal wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was served quietly with dinner. After the plates were cleared, Rachel's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it too quickly, then stood. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, already moving down the hallway. Daniel watched her go, noting the absence of guilt on her face, the ease with which she stepped away. He waited until the bathroom door closed before picking up the phone again. Evan's reply had arrived. Now, followed by a smile he didn't bother to interpret. Daniel felt no rush of victory, no spike of adrenaline, just a cold clarity settling into place. Whoever Evan was, he believed he had permission. Whoever Rachel thought she was becoming, she believed Daniel would never challenge it. He typed once more, and slower this time. "Yes, tonight." The house felt different after that, quieter, as if it knew what was coming. Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, listening to the water run in the bathroom, feeling the weight of 6 years press against his chest. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about balance, about dignity, about what it would take to stop being the man who swallowed everything and smiled through the damage. Outside, the sky darkened. Somewhere across town, another man was likely grabbing his keys, confident, unafraid, walking toward a door that wasn't his. And in that moment, Daniel understood something with startling clarity. The story of his marriage was about to end, but the story of himself was just beginning. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to Rachel's breathing rise and fall beside him, each breath a reminder of how close betrayal could feel without ever touching you. She slept easily, one arm draped across the bed, as if nothing in her world had shifted. That was the part that hurt the most, not the message itself, but how peacefully she rested afterward, as if the life they shared hadn't just cracked beneath them. By morning, Daniel was already awake, showered, dressed. He moved through the house quietly, the way he always did, careful not to wake her. For years, he'd learned to exist without demanding space. He brewed coffee, checked his emails, reviewed his calendar, meetings, deadlines, responsibilities. The same routine that had once made him proud now felt like evidence against him, proof of how predictable he'd become. At work, Daniel was known as reliable, the man who stayed late, the man who fixed problems without being asked. His coworkers trusted him. His boss depended on him. No one knew that just hours earlier, his sense of loyalty had been quietly dismantled by 4 words on a glowing screen. He sat through meetings, nodded at projections, answered questions automatically. Inside, his mind replayed the kitchen scene over and over, dissecting every detail with surgical precision. He wondered when Evan Cole had entered their lives. The name echoed in his thoughts, unwelcome and persistent. Daniel prided himself on knowing Rachel's world, her coworkers, her schedule, her stress points. Evan hadn't been mentioned. That omission now felt intentional. A boundary drawn without Daniel's consent. Rachel texted him around noon. Busy day. Love you. The words sat on his screen like a test. Daniel stared at them for a long time before replying with a simple, "You too." He noticed how easy it had become to lie back, how quickly silence could be weaponized. That evening, he left work early for the first time in months. He drove home slowly, passing familiar streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if the city itself had rearranged while he wasn't looking. He parked a block away from the house and sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, grounding himself. This wasn't about rage. He repeated that to himself. This was about clarity. Inside, the house was quiet. Rachel hadn't returned yet. Daniel walked through each room deliberately, noticing details he'd ignored for years, the framed photos on the wall, their wedding picture still hanging in the hallway, her favorite throw blanket folded neatly on the couch. Nothing looked different. That, too, felt cruel. He checked his phone. No new messages from Evan? That didn't mean much. Daniel understood now how these things worked. Anticipation thrived in silence. He placed Rachel's phone exactly where she usually left it and sat at the dining table, waiting. When she came home, her smile was immediate, practiced. She kissed his cheek, set her bag down, launched into a story about traffic and a delayed meeting. Daniel listened, watching her closely. There was an energy about her he hadn't seen in a long time, lighter, almost buoyant, not happiness, excitement. It flickered beneath the surface, barely contained. They ate dinner together again, another performance of normalcy. Rachel laughed at something on television. Daniel smiled at the appropriate moments. He realized then how much of their marriage had become a script, both of them hitting their marks without questioning the plot. The doorbell rang just after 8. Rachel froze. This time, the hesitation wasn't subtle. Her eyes flicked toward the door, then to Daniel. "Were you expecting someone?" she asked, her voice betraying the calm she tried to maintain. Daniel stood. "I think you were. I think you were." The color drained from her face. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. He walked to the door, each step measured, deliberate. When he opened it, Evan Cole stood on the porch wearing confidence like armor. He was taller than Daniel had expected, well-dressed, his expression relaxed, the kind of man who believed he was welcome wherever he went. For a moment, none of them spoke. Evan's smile faltered first. His eyes darted past Daniel. Searching the hallway behind him, "Is Rachel?" "She's here," Daniel said calmly. "Go ahead. Come in." Evan hesitated, confusion replacing certainty. But curiosity pushed him forward. He stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Rachel appeared in the hallway. Her face, a portrait of shock and fear. "Daniel, I can explain." "No," Daniel said, turning to her. "You've explained enough." Evan looked between them, realization dawning slowly. "Wait, you're her husband," Daniel finished. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. Evan opened his mouth, then closed it. Whatever charm he'd arrived with evaporated under the weight of the truth. Rachel's hands trembled at her sides. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence she'd worn earlier. Daniel gestured toward the living room. "Sit," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. They obeyed. Daniel remained standing, looking at them both not with anger, but with an almost clinical focus. "I want to be very clear," he said. "This isn't a scene. This is a reckoning." Evan swallowed hard. "I didn't know she was married." He lied too quickly. Daniel met his gaze without blinking. "You've been to this house before?" "You knew." Rachel's breath caught. Evan's shoulders slumped, the truth settling in. The confident man from the porch was gone, replaced by someone exposed and unsure. Daniel felt a strange calm wash over him. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, not the confrontation itself, but the realization that he no longer needed their approval, their honesty, or their remorse. He had already seen enough. Outside, the evening deepened into night. Inside the house, 3 lives sat suspended, waiting for consequences to take shape, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel wasn't afraid of what came next. The air in the living room felt heavier than it had any right to be. Daniel could almost hear the clock ticking from the kitchen, each second stretching, dragging the moment forward. Whether any of them were ready or not, Evan sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, knees bouncing despite his effort to appear composed. Rachel remained frozen in the hallway, as if crossing the threshold into the room would make everything real. Daniel finally broke the silence. "Sit down," he said again. Not louder, just firmer. Rachel obeyed this time. She lowered herself onto the armchair opposite Evan, her eyes never lifting from the floor. Daniel noticed the way she clasped her hands together, knuckles whitening. He had seen that gesture before, during stressful meetings, during difficult conversations with family. It was how she held herself together when things slipped out of control. "I want to understand something," Daniel said, his voice steady, almost detached. "Not for closure, not for forgiveness, just for truth." He turned his attention to Evan. "How long?" Evan cleared his throat. "It's not what you think." Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. "That's usually how lies begin." Rachel looked up sharply. "Daniel, please, let me explain." He raised a hand, not angrily, but with finality. "You've had months to explain. This is my turn." Evan shifted uncomfortably. "We worked together, that's it." It started. Casual, talking, complaining about work, about stress, and about marriage. Daniel asked. Evan hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. Rachel's voice cracked. "I never planned for this to happen." Daniel turned to her then. I really looked at her. "That's the part you still don't understand," he said quietly. "Planning isn't what matters. Choosing is." She shook her head, tears finally spilling. "You weren't there, Daniel. You were always tired, always busy. I felt invisible." The words landed, sharp but familiar. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind all day, imagined how much it might hurt to hear her justify it. Strangely, it didn't hurt the way he expected. It felt hollow, like hearing an excuse he'd already outgrown. "I was there," he said. "I was just boring, reliable, predictable. I showed up every day in ways you stopped valuing." Evan stood abruptly. "Look, man, I don't want trouble." "If I'd known," Daniel's gaze snapped back to him. "Sit down." Evan froze, then slowly sat. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, as if even the house refused to look away. Daniel walked to the bookshelf and picked up a framed photo. Their wedding day. Rachel laughing, head thrown back, joy unfiltered. He studied it for a moment before setting it face down on the table. "That man," Daniel said, nodding toward Evan, "thought he was walking into something secret and exciting. You," he turned to Rachel, "thought you were entitled to feel alive again. And I was the fool, funding it all with silence." Rachel sobbed openly now. "I never slept with him." Daniel paused. He considered her words carefully, measuring their weight. "That's the defense you're going with." She looked up, desperate. "It matters." "Only to lawyers," Daniel replied, "and maybe to people still negotiating their conscience." Evan looked between them, panic rising. "I should go." "No," Daniel said calmly. "You should listen." He took out his phone and opened the message thread. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't need to. He watched Evan's face instead, as recognition dawned, followed by shame. "You didn't miss her," Daniel continued. "You missed the version of her that existed outside consequences. And you," he turned back to Rachel, "missed the feeling of being wanted without responsibility." Rachel shook her head. "I was lonely." "So was I," Daniel said. "The difference is, I didn't invite someone else into our marriage." Silence swallowed the room again. Daniel felt something inside him settle. Not closure, not peace, but clarity, the kind that arrives when illusions finally collapse under their own weight. "I'm not asking either of you for apologies," he said. They're meaningless now. What I am doing is ending this tonight." End quote. Rachel's eyes widened. "Ending what? Us?" he said simply. "This marriage, this arrangement where I'm the safe place you come back to after seeking validation elsewhere." She stood, rushing toward him. "Please, we can fix this. I'll cut him off. I'll do anything." Daniel stepped back, creating distance. "That's the problem. You're offering change only because you were caught." Evan finally spoke again, voice low. "I never meant to destroy anything." Daniel met his eyes. "Intent doesn't erase impact. You stepped into a life that wasn't yours. Now you get to step out." Evan nodded quickly, grateful for any exit. He grabbed his jacket and moved toward the door, pausing only once. "I'm sorry," he said, though it sounded more like relief than remorse. The door closed behind him, the click echoing through the house like a verdict. Rachel collapsed onto the couch, shaking. "What happens now?" End quote. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Now, I choose myself." He walked past her, down the hallway, and into the bedroom. He packed a bag with the efficiency of someone who had already mourned the loss. Clothes, documents, essentials. Each item folded felt like a boundary being drawn. When he returned, Rachel was still sitting there, staring at nothing. "I'll be staying elsewhere," Daniel said. "We'll talk about logistics later, through lawyers." She looked up, eyes red. "You're really doing this?" "Yes," he replied. "And for the first time in a long while, I'm not afraid." He walked out of the house without looking back. The night air was cool, grounding. As he stepped into the darkness, Daniel felt the weight of what he was leaving behind, but also the unmistakable lightness of what he was finally taking with him. Daniel drove without a destination for nearly an hour. The city lights blurred past his windshield. Familiar streets, losing their meaning as distance grew between him and the house he had just left. His phone buzzed twice. Then again. He didn't look. He already knew who it was. Some conversations, once delayed long enough, stopped being conversations at all. He eventually pulled into a quiet parking lot near the river, killed the engine, and sat in the silence. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation began to fade, replaced by something heavier. Grief didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, filling the spaces anger had vacated. He pressed his palms against the steering wheel, grounding himself, reminding himself that walking away didn't mean he was weak. It meant he was done bleeding quietly. That night, Daniel checked into a modest hotel a few miles away. The room smelled faintly of detergent and stale air. Nothing personal, nothing familiar. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall. For years, his life had revolved around accommodating someone else's needs, moods, and silences. Now, stripped of that purpose, he felt unsteady, like a man who had been walking on a tilted surface and was only now realizing it. Sleep came in fragments. Every time he closed his eyes, memories surfaced uninvited. Rachel laughing on their honeymoon, Rachel crying after her first big failure at work, Rachel promising, years ago, that she would never lie to him the way her parents had lied to each other. By morning, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. At work, Daniel asked for personal leave. His boss looked surprised but didn't argue. "Take care of yourself," she said, sincere enough to sting. Daniel nodded, unsure what taking care of himself even meant anymore. He spent the day walking. No music, no distractions, just streets, storefronts, strangers, living lives untouched by his unraveling. The world hadn't paused for his heartbreak. That realization was both cruel and strangely comforting. It meant healing didn't require permission. By the third day, Rachel stopped calling and started texting. Long messages, apologies layered with explanations, explanations layered with regret. Daniel read them once, then archived the thread without responding. He wasn't ready to negotiate his pain. Evan's name appeared once in his inbox, An email this time. Short, apologetic, defensive. Daniel deleted it without opening. Some voices didn't deserve space in his healing. The silence gave Daniel room to think, and with that space came clarity he hadn't expected. He began to see the past not as a sudden betrayal, but as a pattern he had tolerated too long. The small dismissals, the emotional absences, the way he had slowly trained himself not to ask for more, because asking had started to feel like burdening someone who no longer wanted to carry him. One afternoon, he sat in a cafe by the window, watching rain streak down the glass. Across the room, a couple argued in hushed voices, tension thick between them. Daniel recognized the look, the exhaustion of two people pretending something wasn't broken. He realized then that staying would have meant becoming a quieter version of himself until there was nothing left to defend. The lawyer's office was next. Neutral walls, neutral language, words like separation and assets and timelines spoken without emotion. Daniel listened, asked questions, signed papers. Each signature felt like closing a door gently but firmly. He wasn't slamming anything shut. He was choosing not to stand in the doorway anymore. That evening, he returned to the hotel to find a message waiting. Rachel, again, this time shorter. Can we talk? Just once. I owe you that. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. He knew what that conversation would look like. Tears, promises, revisionist history. A plea for the version of him who had always softened in the face of her pain. He typed a response, erased it, typed again. Finally, he sent something simple. Not yet, I need time. He set the phone down and felt an unexpected sense of relief. Boundaries, he was learning, weren't cruel. They were necessary. Days turned into a week. Daniel moved into a small furnished apartment closer to work. It was temporary, but it was his. He unpacked slowly, deliberately, deciding what pieces of his old life deserved space in the new one. Some things stayed in boxes. Others found their way onto shelves, reclaimed without their old context. One evening, as he sat alone eating takeout, Daniel realized something else had changed. He wasn't replaying the confrontation anymore. He wasn't imagining alternate endings or sharper words. The story had stopped looping. That was progress. Even if it didn't feel triumphant, he knew the real reckoning wasn't over. Consequences had a way of unfolding slowly, especially when pride and reputation were involved. Rachel would have to face her own fallout, Evan too. But for the first time, Daniel understood that their journeys no longer required his presence. As night settled over the apartment, Daniel stood by the window, watching the city glow beneath him. His life hadn't turned out the way he'd planned. The marriage he'd invested in was gone, but beneath the loss, something steadier was forming, a sense of self he had neglected, a voice he had silenced. He didn't know yet what healing would look like. He only knew that it had begun the moment he chose not to beg for honesty from people who had already spent it. The first sign that the fallout was spreading came quietly, almost politely. Daniel was at his desk late one afternoon, the office mostly empty, when his manager stopped by with a careful look on her face. She didn't sit. She didn't smile. "Can you step into the conference room for a minute?" she asked. Daniel nodded, already sensing the shift in air. Inside the glass-walled room, she closed the door and folded her arms, choosing her words the way people did when they were about to deliver news they didn't fully understand themselves. "There's been a situation brought to HR," she said. "It involves someone you're connected to, your wife." Daniel didn't react. He waited, she exhaled. "And a coworker of hers, Evan Cole." The name landed with dull finality. Daniel felt a strange detachment, as if he were hearing about someone else's life. "I assumed this would happen eventually," he said. His manager studied him. "You already knew." "I already lived it," Daniel replied. What followed was a series of questions, measured, procedural, impersonal. Had Daniel witnessed inappropriate behavior? Had he been threatened? Did he feel unsafe? He answered calmly, truthfully, without embellishment. When it was over, his manager nodded, relief flickering across her face. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this," she said. "You don't have to be involved any further unless you choose to be." Daniel thanked her and returned to his desk. As he shut down his computer, he realized something unexpected. He felt lighter. The secret was no longer his to carry alone. The truth, once exposed, had a way of finding its own momentum. Across town, Rachel was unraveling. Daniel learned this, not through her, but through fragments mutual acquaintances who stopped texting altogether, others who reached out awkwardly, unsure which side to stand on. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't defend himself or accuse her. Silence, he discovered, was not passive. It was precise. Rachel finally showed up at his apartment one evening. Without warning, Daniel saw her through the peephole, standing in the hallway with red eyes and a posture that spoke of someone who had been standing too long under judgment. He hesitated before opening the door. Then he did. She looked smaller than he remembered, not physically, but emotionally, stripped of the confidence she'd once worn so effortlessly. "Please," she said before he could speak. "Just 5 minutes." He stepped aside, letting her in. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He's been suspended," she said. "HR is investigating everything. People are talking." Daniel nodded. "That's usually how consequences work." Her eyes filled again. "I didn't think it would go this far." "That's the problem," Daniel said quietly. "You didn't think." She flinched but didn't argue. "I lost control," she whispered. "I felt invisible. And when someone finally noticed me, I grabbed onto it without asking what it would cost." "And now?" Daniel asked. "Now I see everything I destroyed." Daniel leaned back, studying her. He searched for the old reflex, the urge to comfort, to soften, to reassure. It didn't come. "Seeing it now doesn't change the damage," he said. "It just explains it." She looked up at him then, desperation raw. "Do you hate me?" The question surprised him. He considered it carefully. "No," he said, "but I don't trust you. And without trust, love doesn't survive." Her shoulders sagged. "Is there any chance?" "No," Daniel said gently. "Not because you're beyond forgiveness, but because I'm beyond negotiating my worth." The words settled between them, heavy and final. Rachel nodded slowly, as if absorbing a truth she had been avoiding for months. She stood, smoothing her jacket, avoiding his eyes. "I hope one day you understand how deeply sorry I am," she said. Daniel held the door open. "I already do," he replied. "That doesn't mean I stay." After she left, Daniel locked the door and rested his forehead against it for a moment. The encounter hadn't reopened wounds the way he feared. It had closed them further. He realized then that healing wasn't about forgetting pain. It was about no longer letting it steer your choices. Weeks passed. Evan resigned quietly. No dramatic downfall, no public spectacle, just a sudden absence from company directories and whispered conversations that eventually moved on to someone else's mistakes. Daniel felt no satisfaction in it. Only confirmation, actions, sooner or later, always circled back. Daniel began rebuilding his life in small, deliberate ways. He joined a gym not to punish himself, but to reclaim the physical space he'd neglected. He cooked meals for one, discovering flavors he'd never tried because they hadn't been Rachel's favorite. He reconnected with friends he'd drifted from, relationships he had let fade, under the assumption that marriage required exclusivity of attention. One evening, over dinner with an old friend, Daniel laughed a real laugh, unforced, surprising them both. The sound startled him. It felt like meeting a version of himself he hadn't seen in years. Later that night, alone again, he reflected on the irony of it all. Betrayal had taken something from him, yes, but it had also stripped away illusions he'd clung to out of fear. He no longer measured his value by how much he could endure for someone else. He measured it by how honestly he lived with himself. Standing by his apartment window, watching the city breathe beneath him, Daniel understood something essential. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it arrived quietly. in the form of self-respect reclaimed and boundaries finally enforced. And that, he realized, was a far more lasting kind of reckoning. Time didn't rush Daniel anymore. It moved at his pace now, no longer dictated by someone else's expectations or emotional weather. The weeks after Rachel's visit settled into a strange, steady rhythm. Mornings were quiet, evenings were his. The absence that once echoed through his apartment slowly transformed into space room, to think, to breathe, to rebuild without apology. Then, one afternoon, a notification appeared on his phone that tightened something in his chest. Not from Rachel, not from Evan, from an unfamiliar number. "This is Maya Lawson. We've never met, but I believe we should talk." Daniel stared at the message for a long time. He didn't recognize the name, but something about the tone, measured, deliberate, made him respond. "About what?" The reply came quickly. "About Evan. And about what he didn't tell either of you." They met the next day in a quiet cafe near the courthouse. Maya arrived early, sitting straight-backed with a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. She looked composed, but her eyes carried the weariness of someone who had learned difficult truths too late. "I'm Evan's former partner," she said once Daniel sat down. "Business and personal." Daniel didn't interrupt. "I ended things months ago," she continued. "Not because of Rachel, because of patterns, lies, women he minimized as just friends or work stress. When I heard what happened, I realized you deserved to know this wasn't isolated." Daniel absorbed her words carefully. "I already know who he is," he said, "but I appreciate the confirmation." Maya nodded. "There's more. Evan manipulated workplace dynamics, promotions, favor trading. Rachel wasn't the first, and she wouldn't have been the last." Daniel exhaled slowly. The story widened, deepening in ways that no longer shocked him. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Maya said. "I've already spoken to HR. I just didn't want you thinking this was something you failed to see. He thrives on people blaming themselves." That, more than anything, stayed with Daniel after they parted. The idea that manipulation often survived because good people assumed fault where there was none. Later that evening, Daniel received another message, this time from Rachel. She told him she'd been asked to resign, that HR had uncovered things Evan had promised would never surface, that she was terrified. Daniel read the message twice. Then he set the phone down without replying. He didn't feel triumph. He felt distance, a widening emotional gap that no longer hurt to maintain. Days later, his lawyer called. "Rachel is asking for mediation," she said. "She's hoping to avoid a prolonged process," Daniel agreed. Not out of sympathy, but out of clarity. Dragging the past forward wouldn't give him more closure than he already had. The mediation room was sterile and bright. Rachel looked exhausted, smaller still than the last time he'd seen her. When she spoke, her voice shook, not with dramatics, but with genuine fear. "I've lost my job," she said. "Most of my friends won't talk to me. My parents know everything. I need fairness." Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. When it was his turn, he spoke calmly. "I'm not here to punish you," he said. "I'm here to separate cleanly. That's all I want." The terms were straightforward. No theatrics. No emotional bargaining. When it was over, Rachel looked at him with something close to disbelief. "You're really not trying to hurt me," she said quietly. Daniel met her gaze. "I don't need to. Life already is." He walked out of the building feeling lighter than he had in months. That night, Daniel attended a small gathering hosted by a coworker. Nothing fancy, just conversation. Laughter, shared stories. At one point, someone asked about his divorce. Not prying, just curious. Daniel answered honestly, briefly. No bitterness, no victimhood. Later, standing on the balcony with a drink in his hand, Daniel realized something profound. The story no longer defined him. It had become context, not identity. As autumn crept in, Daniel took a weekend trip alone, mountains, silence, cold air that stung his lungs and reminded him he was alive. Hiking trails forced him forward, step by step, no shortcuts, no distractions. At the summit, overlooking a valley bathed in late afternoon light, Daniel felt a peace that didn't need explanation. He thought about the man he'd been, the one who equated love with endurance, loyalty with self-erasure. He honored that man for surviving. Then he let him go. Back in the city, Daniel received one final message from Rachel. Short, unadorned. I hope you find happiness. I'm sorry I couldn't be part of it. Daniel read it once. Then he typed a reply he never sent. He didn't need the last word. He already had the last truth. He stood by his window that night, watching the city glow beneath him, aware of how much had changed and how much hadn't. Betrayal had cracked his life open, but it hadn't destroyed him. It had revealed him. And for the first time, Daniel wasn't rebuilding for anyone else's approval. He was building a life that could stand on its own. Winter arrived quietly, without ceremony, the way most permanent changes did. Daniel noticed it one morning, when frost traced the edges of his apartment window, thin white lines, catching the early light. He stood there longer than necessary, coffee cooling in his hand, thinking about how the season mirrored his life, stripped down, exposed, but strangely clean. The divorce papers were finalized on a Tuesday afternoon. No courtroom drama, no final speech, just signatures, polite nods, and a door closing somewhere behind him. When Daniel stepped outside afterward, the air felt sharper, colder, but honest. He took a long breath and realized he wasn't holding anything back anymore. That night, he went for a walk instead of going home. The streets were busy, with people rushing toward warmth and company. Couples held hands, friends laughed, strangers brushed past without seeing him. Once, this would have made him feel invisible. Now, it reminded him that anonymity could be a gift. His phone buzzed as he crossed an intersection. A message from his sister, Lena. I heard it's official. You okay? Daniel smiled faintly and replied, I'm learning to be. She called him immediately. That sounds like something someone says when they're not okay. She said gently, I'm not broken, Daniel replied, just recalibrating. Lena was quiet for a moment. Come stay with me for a few days. You don't have to talk, just exist. He agreed before his instincts could interfere. Lena's house was louder than Daniel's apartment. Kids running through hallways, music playing in the background, life unapologetically happening. It overwhelmed him at first. Then, it grounded him. He helped cook dinner, listened to stories that had nothing to do with betrayal or loss, and laughed when her youngest spilled juice across the table. Later that night, sitting on the porch with Lena, Daniel admitted something he hadn't said out loud before. I don't miss her the way I thought I would. Lena didn't look surprised. You grieved the marriage while you were still in it. That truth settled into him like a puzzle piece, clicking into place. When Daniel returned to the city, work felt different, lighter. His focus sharpened. He took on a new project, one that required initiative, creativity, risk. The old Daniel might have declined, fearing disruption. This one accepted without hesitation. Recognition followed, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. His ideas were heard, his boundaries respected. He left on time without guilt. He stopped apologizing for needing space. One evening, after a late meeting, Daniel found himself sharing an elevator with a woman from another department. They exchanged polite conversation about the weather, the long hours, the absurdity of corporate life. Her name was Claire. She smiled easily, without expectation. When the elevator reached the lobby, she hesitated. Would you like to grab a coffee sometime? She asked. Casual but sincere. Daniel paused. Not because he wasn't interested, but because he was honest enough now to check in with himself first. He felt no fear, no urge to rush, just openness. I'd like that, he said. They kept it simple. Coffee turned into walks into conversations that stretched longer than planned. Daniel noticed how different it felt to be seen without performing, to be listened to without defending. Claire didn't fill a void. She stood beside him in a space he had already claimed. Meanwhile, Rachel faded into the background of his life. Occasionally, her name surfaced through mutual acquaintances she'd moved, changed industries, started therapy. Daniel wished her no harm. He simply no longer carried her outcomes as his responsibility. One afternoon, as spring hinted at returning, Daniel received an unexpected email from HR. An internal audit had concluded. Evan's actions had led to policy changes, restructuring, accountability measures. The company thanked him for his professionalism. During a difficult period, Daniel closed the email and leaned back in his chair. Justice hadn't been loud. It hadn't required his participation. It had simply unfolded. That evening, he stood on his balcony again, city lights flickering on as dusk deepened. Claire joined him, handing him a glass of wine. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the world move below them. "You seem steady," she said. Daniel considered the word. "I am," he replied. "For the first time, I think." Later, alone, Daniel reflected on the man he used to be, the one who mistook endurance for love, silence for strength. He didn't judge that man anymore. He understood him. And understanding had given way to forgiveness. Betrayal had once felt like the end of his story. Now he saw it as a turning point, the moment life demanded he stop shrinking to fit into someone else's shadow. He went to bed that night without replaying old conversations, without questioning his choices. Sleep came easily, deeply, and as the city settled into its nighttime rhythm, Daniel knew something with absolute certainty. He hadn't just survived the betrayal, he had outgrown it. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through small mercies, longer daylight, warmer mornings, the quiet hum of life, restarting after months of restraint. Daniel noticed it most in himself. The heaviness that once greeted him at dawn was gone. In its place was a cautious optimism he didn't rush to define. His relationship with Claire remained deliberately unhurried. They saw each other once or twice a week, never pressing, never demanding. It was the first connection Daniel had experienced that didn't feel like an obligation or a performance. She didn't ask him to explain his past unless he chose to share it. And when he did, she listened without trying to fix anything. One evening, as they walked along the river, Claire asked softly, "Do you ever feel like something unfinished is still following you?" Daniel stopped. The question wasn't accusatory. It was perceptive. He thought for a moment before answering. "Not following," he said, "more like echoing." She nodded, understanding more than he'd expected. That echo returned sooner than Daniel anticipated. It came in the form of a letter, delivered to his apartment one quiet afternoon. No return address, just his name, written carefully on the envelope in handwriting he recognized immediately. Rachel's. He didn't open it right away. He set it on the table and went about his evening cooking dinner, watering the plant he'd somehow managed to keep alive, answering a few emails. Only later, when the apartment had settled into silence, did he finally sit down and unfold the paper. The letter wasn't long. No apologies layered with desperation, no pleas, just acknowledgement. She wrote about therapy, about how uncomfortable it was to confront her own patterns instead of rewriting the past. She admitted she'd confused attention with worth, excitement with love. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask to meet. She ended the letter with a single sentence that stayed with Daniel longer than he expected. "I finally understand that loving someone doesn't entitle you to escape yourself." Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He felt no rush of emotion, just a quiet recognition. The echo, it seemed, was fading. At work, Daniel's new project gained traction. His team expanded. Responsibility grew. So did his confidence. He noticed how often people sought his input now, not because he was agreeable, but because he was clear. He said no when necessary. He left when his workday ended. He protected the life he was building outside those walls. Then, one afternoon, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. The message that followed was unexpected. "Daniel, this is Evan Cole. I know I have no right to contact you. I won't again. I just needed to say, you were right about everything." Daniel listened to the message once. He didn't replay it. He didn't respond. Some closures didn't require participation. That night, he met Claire for dinner at a small restaurant, tucked away from the noise of the city. Halfway through the meal, she reached across the table and took his hand, tentative but certain. "I don't want to rush you," she said, "but I need to know something." Daniel met her gaze. "Ask, are you with me because you're ready?" she said, "or because you're healed enough not to bleed on someone else?" The question was honest, necessary. Daniel took a breath. "I'm with you because I'm no longer trying to replace something I lost," he said. "I'm choosing something new." She smiled, not relieved, not triumphant, just present. Later, alone in his apartment, Daniel stood by the window again. The city stretched out before him, alive and indifferent. He thought about how much he'd changed, not in loud, cinematic ways, but in the quiet decisions that accumulated over time. He no longer checked his phone for validation. He no longer measured his worth by someone else's attention. He had learned the difference between being needed and being chosen, and he refused to confuse the two again. The past didn't haunt him anymore. It informed him. Daniel turned off the lights and went to bed, not as a man defined by betrayal, but as one shaped by what he did afterward. The echo had finally gone silent. In its place was something steadier, something earned, peace. The first time Daniel realized he had stopped bracing himself for bad news, it startled him. It happened on an ordinary Thursday morning, when his phone buzzed during breakfast. He glanced at the screen out of habit, expecting a complication, a reminder that peace was temporary. Instead, it was a calendar alert for a meeting he had scheduled weeks earlier. Nothing more, nothing less. His shoulders relaxed before he could stop them. That was when he understood how deeply vigilance had shaped him before, how betrayal trained the mind to wait for impact even after the danger passed. Life moved forward in subtle, cumulative ways. Claire became a steady presence, not woven into every hour, but anchored firmly in his days. They learned each other's rhythms. She liked early mornings and black coffee. He preferred evenings and quiet music. They didn't rush to synchronize everything. There was no urgency to prove permanence. That, Daniel realized, was the difference between attachment and choice. One afternoon, Claire invited him to meet her parents. The idea would have terrified him once. Now, it simply felt like a step, not a leap. Dinner was warm, unremarkable, filled with questions that came from curiosity rather than evaluation. No one asked about his divorce directly. They spoke about work, travel, books. Normal things. Daniel left feeling something he hadn't expected, belonging without performance. The past, however, had a way of resurfacing when least convenient. Daniel received a call from Lena late one night. Her voice was tense. "Rachel's in the hospital," she said. "She called Mom. It's not life-threatening, but she's not doing well." Daniel closed his eyes. The news didn't spark panic, but it did stir something complicated. Concern without obligation. Empathy without surrender. "Do they need me?" he asked. "No," Lena replied. "I just thought you should know." After the call ended, Daniel sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who would have rushed to the hospital without hesitation, confusing responsibility with love. That instinct still existed, but it no longer ruled him. He sent a brief message to Rachel's mother, offering support. Nothing more, nothing less. Days later, Rachel emailed him, not to ask for help, not to reopen wounds, just to inform him she'd been diagnosed with severe anxiety and depression, conditions she had ignored for years. Therapy had helped. Hitting bottom had forced honesty. Daniel read the email carefully. He felt sadness, not for what was lost, but for what had never been fully understood when it mattered. He replied with a single sentence, "I hope you find peace and stability." That was the end of it. At work, Daniel was offered a promotion he hadn't pursued. It came with more responsibility, a larger team, and influence he once would have shied away from. This time, he accepted after thoughtful consideration, not because it validated him, but because it aligned with the man he was becoming. He noticed how often people mirrored his tone now. Calm invited calm. Boundaries invited respect. Leadership, he learned, wasn't about control. It was about consistency. One evening, while organizing old files, Daniel stumbled across a folder of photographs from his marriage. He hadn't seen them since moving out. For a moment, he considered deleting them all. Instead, he sat on the floor and looked through them slowly. There was no surge of longing, no spike of pain, just memory. He saw two people who had tried in the only ways they knew how, two people who had mistaken comfort for connection and endurance for love. He didn't blame himself anymore. He didn't absolve her either. He simply acknowledged the truth without ornament. Daniel kept a few photos, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for the life that had shaped him. The rest, he let go. Later that week, Claire asked him something that surprised him. "Do you think you'd ever get married again?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He appreciated the absence of pressure in the question. "Maybe," he said finally, "but only if it feels like an extension of who I am, not a replacement for something missing." She smiled. "That's a good answer." As summer approached, Daniel began mentoring a younger colleague who reminded him uncomfortably of his former self, eager to please, slow to advocate, terrified of rocking the boat. He didn't impose advice. He asked questions instead, encouraged reflection, offered perspective when asked. One afternoon, that colleague said, "You seem solid, like nothing really shakes you." Daniel considered that. "Things still shake me," he replied. "They just don't decide who I am anymore." That night, standing on his balcony, Daniel watched a storm roll in from the horizon. Thunder echoed distantly. Rain followed soon after, heavy and cleansing. He didn't move inside. He stood there, letting the cool mist brush his skin, grounded in the present. He understood now that healing wasn't a finish line. It was a practice, one that required honesty, patience, and the courage to remain open without abandoning yourself. Betrayal had once been the loudest chapter of his life. Now, it was background noise audible, but no longer commanding attention. Daniel went inside, closed the door, and felt an unshakable certainty settle in his chest. He was no longer defined by what had been done to him. He was defined by what he chose to become after. The summer heat arrived abruptly, pressing down on the city with a weight that reminded Daniel of how life could still surprise you. Even after everything had settled, he adjusted to it easily, trading routines that once revolved around obligation for ones shaped by intention. Mornings began earlier now, not out of anxiety but choice. He ran along the river before work, letting the steady rhythm of his breath replace the constant internal dialogue that had once dominated his thoughts. Claire noticed the change before he did. One evening, as they cooked together in his apartment, she leaned against the counter and studied him quietly. "You're different lately," she said. "Not in a big way, in a grounded way." Daniel smiled faintly. "I finally stopped arguing with reality." That night, he told her something he hadn't planned to say, about the moment in the kitchen, about the message, about replying instead of confronting. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't soften it either. He spoke as someone recounting a turning point, rather than reliving trauma. Claire listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once. "You didn't try to win," she said. "You chose to see clearly." The words stayed with him long after she left. At work, Daniel's new role placed him in meetings he once would have avoided. Decision-making rooms, conversations where hesitation carried consequences. He surprised himself with how naturally he stepped into them. He wasn't louder than anyone else. He was just precise. That precision earned trust quickly. Then came the call he hadn't expected from Rachel's father. Daniel hesitated before answering. The man's voice sounded older than he remembered, worn down by events he hadn't anticipated. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" Daniel asked, genuinely confused. "For not destroying her," the man replied quietly. "You could have—" Daniel exhaled slowly. "I wasn't interested in that." "I know," the man said. "She's learning. Slowly. Painfully. But learning." Daniel ended the call feeling neither vindicated nor burdened, just aware. Healing, he realized, didn't always happen in isolation. Sometimes it rippled outward, changing people you no longer traveled alongside. Later that week, Daniel received an invitation to speak at a small leadership workshop hosted by his company. The topic was resilience. He nearly declined. The word felt overused, diluted, but something nudged him to accept. Standing in front of a room of unfamiliar faces, Daniel didn't tell his story directly. He spoke instead about patterns, about ignoring discomfort because it felt safer than conflict, about how strength often looked like endurance until it didn't. He watched recognition spread quietly across the room. Afterward, a woman approached him. "Thank you," she said simply. "I needed to hear that." That was when Daniel understood that his experience had evolved into something useful, not because of the pain itself, but because of what he'd done with it. His relationship with Claire deepened in ways that felt organic rather than urgent. They traveled together for the first time. A short trip to the coast, long walks, quiet mornings, no tension about expectations. When they disagreed, they spoke. When something felt uncertain, they paused instead of pushing through. One evening, watching the sun dissolve into the ocean, Claire asked him, "What do you want your life to look like in 5 years?" Daniel didn't rush to answer. "Stable," he said finally. "Not perfect, just honest." She smiled. "That's rare." Back home, Daniel discovered that some wounds left faint marks even after healing. Certain songs, certain phrases, but they no longer controlled him. They passed through like weather noticed, not feared. One night, as he cleaned out the last box from his old storage unit, Daniel found his wedding ring at the bottom of a drawer. He held it for a long moment, turning it over in his palm. It felt lighter than he remembered. He didn't throw it away immediately. He set it on the table, finished organizing, then came back to it. When he finally dropped it into the trash, there was no ceremony, no regret, just finality. As autumn began to approach again, marking nearly a full year since the kitchen moment that had changed everything, Daniel felt a quiet gratitude settle over him, not for the betrayal but for the clarity it forced. Some lessons, he realized, arrived wrapped in loss because comfort would never have taught them. He stood by his window that night, city lights stretching endlessly below, and felt something close to pride. Not in surviving, but in refusing to become smaller because of what had tried to diminish him. Daniel knew there were still chapters ahead, unknown ones, but for the first time, he trusted himself to write them with intention, and that trust, earned, tested, and reclaimed, felt like the truest victory of all. Autumn returned with a familiarity that felt almost ceremonial, as if the year itself were closing a loop. Leaves gathered along sidewalks, crunching underfoot as Daniel walked to work each morning. He noticed how differently he moved through the world, now less guarded, more deliberate. The sharp vigilance that once lived in his chest had softened into awareness. He was present without being tense, open without being careless. One evening, Daniel attended a small gathering hosted by a community center near his apartment. It was meant to be informal conversation, shared stories, a way for neighbors to connect. He hadn't planned on speaking, but when someone asked why he volunteered there now, he found himself answering honestly. "I needed to remember who I was outside of survival," he said. The room went quiet, not uncomfortably, but attentively. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Sometimes truth landed harder when left unpolished. After the gathering, a man lingered behind, younger, nervous. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "How did you know when to walk away?" Daniel considered him carefully. when staying required me to stop respecting myself, he replied. That's usually the moment. The man nodded slowly, as if filing the answer away for later. That night, Daniel thought about how often people mistook endurance for loyalty. How many lives were shaped by the belief that leaving was failure instead of self-preservation. He realized then that his story had quietly shifted from personal recovery to something broader. A reference point, a mirror. Claire noticed it too. You're changing again, she said one evening as they cooked dinner together. Not because you're healing, but because you're leading. The word made him pause. I'm not trying to. I know, she said. That's why it works. Their relationship had grown steady, rooted in choice rather than fear. They argued sometimes. They disagreed. But there was no undercurrent of threat, no silent scorekeeping. When something felt off, they named it. When one of them needed space, it was given freely. Daniel hadn't realized how exhausting love could be when it was built on uncertainty until he experienced it without that weight. One afternoon, Daniel received a message from his lawyer. The final financial matters were resolved. No loose ends, no future obligations. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, letting the reality settle. This chapter was truly closed. He didn't celebrate. He didn't mourn. He acknowledged it and moved on. At work, Daniel was asked to mentor a new team formally, not because of tenure, but because of temperament. His ability to stay composed under pressure had become a quiet asset. He taught them how to ask better questions, how to challenge assumptions without escalating conflict, how to walk away from conversations that demanded too much without offering clarity. During one session, someone asked, "What's the hardest lesson you've learned?" Daniel answered without hesitation. That silence is a choice, and every choice teaches people how to treat you. The room fell still. He saw recognition in their eyes. The lesson had landed. As winter approached again, Daniel and Claire discussed the future, not in terms of promises, but possibilities, living arrangements, travel, what commitment meant when it wasn't driven by fear of loss. I don't need certainty, Daniel told her. I need honesty. Claire nodded. That's rare, she said again, as if reaffirming something she'd noticed long ago. One night, unable to sleep, Daniel found himself rereading the letter Rachel had written months earlier. He realized something then. Forgiveness wasn't an event. It was a posture. One he'd adopted, not for her sake, but for his own. He no longer wished things had happened differently. He wished only that he had trusted himself sooner. As the year drew to a close, Daniel stood once more on his balcony, watching the city prepare for another season. Lights flickered on. Windows glowed. Somewhere below, lives unfolded, messy, hopeful, unresolved. He thought about the man he had been in the kitchen that night. The one who chose restraint over chaos. The one who replied instead of reacting. That decision had changed everything, not because it was clever, but because it was honest. Daniel understood now that healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about integrating it without letting it dictate the future. Betrayal had introduced him to himself in a way comfort never could. He went inside, closed the door, and felt grounded in a life that finally fit. Winter settled in fully this time. Firm and unapologetic, the air carried a sharpness that woke Daniel each morning before his alarm, a reminder that comfort was no longer guaranteed, and strangely, he welcomed it. There was honesty in the cold. It didn't pretend to be gentle. The company's year-end review season arrived, and with it, the quiet hum of evaluation and reflection. Daniel sat across from his director in a glass office overlooking the city, listening as she spoke about growth, leadership, and trust. When she mentioned his name in the same sentence as future executive track, he felt something shift, not excitement exactly, but recognition. This wasn't validation he'd chased. It was alignment. I didn't always speak up, he admitted during the conversation. I used to think being agreeable was the same as being valuable. His director nodded. It's a common mistake. You corrected it. That word corrected stayed with him long after the meeting ended, not fixed, not redeemed, corrected, as if life had knocked him slightly off course once, and everything since had been about adjusting his internal compass. That evening, Daniel attended a small holiday event hosted by the community center. There was music, laughter, mismatched decorations strung with care rather than precision. He watched people arrive carrying their own stories, some heavy, some hopeful, all unfinished. A year ago, he would have blended into the background. Now, he found himself engaged, present, unafraid of being seen. During a quiet moment near the refreshment table, a woman approached him, middle-aged, composed, eyes sharp with lived experience. "You're Daniel, aren't you?" she asked. He nodded, surprised. "I'm Rachel's therapist," she said gently. "She spoke about you often, with honesty. That wasn't easy for her." Daniel felt a brief tightening in his chest, not pain, but alertness. "I hope she's doing well," he said. "She is," the woman replied. Slowly, "I wanted you to know something, if you're willing to hear it." Daniel considered, then nodded again. "She's learning that accountability isn't self-punishment," the therapist continued, "and that the story she told herself about you, that you were distant, unavailable, was incomplete. You were present, she just wasn't listening." Daniel absorbed that quietly. He didn't feel the urge to defend himself or correct the record. The truth no longer required his participation to stand. "Thank you for telling me," he said simply. Claire noticed the exchange from across the room. Later, as they walked home through softly falling snow, she asked, "Did that bring anything back up?" Daniel thought for a moment. "It brought clarity," he said, "and that's different." They walked in comfortable silence, their breath visible in the cold air. When they reached his building, Claire paused. "I'm proud of you," she said, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. The weeks that followed were quieter, intentional. Daniel spent more time reading, less time scrolling. He volunteered consistently. He began writing again, not for an audience, but for himself. Pages filled with reflections, fragments of insight, moments he didn't want to forget. Writing became a way of listening inwardly without judgment. On New Year's Eve, Daniel chose not to attend any large gatherings. Instead, he invited a small group of friends over, people who knew him in different chapters of his life and accepted all of them without comparison. As midnight approached, they shared small intentions rather than resolutions. No grand promise, just direction. When the countdown ended and the room filled with cheers, Daniel stepped onto the balcony alone for a moment. Fireworks cracked across the sky, brief and bright, disappearing as quickly as they came. He realized then how much he'd changed. He no longer confused intensity with meaning. He no longer chased moments meant to distract him from unresolved truth. Claire joined him, wrapping a blanket around both of them. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I don't need a new year to start over," Daniel replied. "I already did." As January unfolded, Daniel received an unexpected email from a man who had attended one of his workshops months earlier. He wrote about leaving a toxic relationship, about recognizing himself in Daniel's words, about choosing self-respect over familiarity. Daniel read the message twice. Then he sat back, stunned not by pride, but by responsibility. Stories, he realized, didn't end when the pain faded. They ended when meaning emerged. One night, unable to sleep, Daniel revisited the memory of the kitchen, the warmth, the phone lighting up. The moment everything changed. For the first time, he didn't feel tension there. No anger, no regret, just gratitude for the clarity that followed. He understood now that injustice didn't define the end of a story. Response did. As winter began to loosen its grip, Daniel felt steady in a way that didn't depend on circumstances. He had faced betrayal without becoming bitter. He had chosen dignity without demanding apology. He had built a life that could absorb loss without collapsing, and that, he realized, was the quiet triumph no one could take from him. The first warm day of the year arrived without warning. sunlight pouring through Daniel's windows, as if the city had collectively decided to exhale. He stood in the kitchen, different kitchen now, a different life, and noticed how the light fell across the counter. For a brief moment, the memory tried to surface. Another kitchen, another evening, another version of himself. But the feeling passed quickly, like a shadow crossing glass. Daniel had learned not to fight memories anymore. He let them come, let them go. They no longer demanded anything from him. That afternoon, he took a personal day from work. Not because he was overwhelmed, but because he wasn't. He walked through a nearby park, watching families picnic. Couples argue softly, children run without concern for anything beyond the next laugh. Life in its raw, unfiltered state, messy, ordinary, real. He sat on a bench and opened his notebook, the one he'd been filling over the past months. Most of it wasn't narrative, just observations, lessons written plainly. Without drama, one line caught his attention, something he'd written weeks earlier without much thought. Self-respect is not loud, it is consistent. Daniel closed the notebook and leaned back, letting that sink in. For most of his life, he'd believed respect was something you earned by giving more, by staying longer, by absorbing discomfort quietly. Now he understood it was something you practiced daily, especially when no one was watching. Later that evening, he met Claire for dinner at a small place they both loved. Halfway through the meal, she studied him with the same thoughtful expression she wore when she was about to ask something important. "I've been thinking," she said, "about us, about where this is going." Daniel nodded, calm. "Me too." She hesitated, not from fear, but from care. "I don't want us to drift forward just because things are good. I want us to choose deliberately." Daniel appreciated that more than she knew. "So do I," he said. "And I need to be honest about something." She waited. "There was a time when I would have clung to this," he continued. "To you, to the idea of us, not because it wasn't real, but because I would have been afraid to lose it." "And now," she asked. "Now I choose you," Daniel said, meeting her eyes. "But I don't need you to complete me, and I don't want to be someone you rely on at the cost of yourself." Claire smiled, soft and steady. "That's exactly why I'm here." They walked back to his apartment in comfortable silence. When they reached the door, Claire stopped. "I don't need an answer now," she said. "But I want you to know I see a future here, not because of what you've been through, but because of how you live now." Daniel watched her leave, feeling neither pressure nor uncertainty, just alignment. Over the following weeks, Daniel made decisions that once would have terrified him. He turned down a project that would have required constant travel, choosing balance over visibility. He delegated more, trusting others. Instead of carrying everything himself, he said no to invitations that didn't align with the life he was building, and yes to moments that nourished it. One evening, while cleaning out old digital files, Daniel came across a voice memo he'd recorded shortly after leaving the house that night. He almost deleted it without listening. Almost. Instead, he pressed play. His own voice filled the room, tight, controlled, uncertain, talking about confusion, about dignity, about not knowing what came next, but knowing he couldn't stay. Daniel listened without flinching. When the recording ended, he sat quietly, struck by the distance between the man who'd spoken those words and the one listening now. He didn't delete the file. He labeled it simply, "Turning Point." At work, Daniel's influence continued to grow, not because he sought it, but because others trusted his steadiness. He was asked to weigh in on difficult personnel decisions, conflict resolution, ethical gray areas. He approached each with the same principle that guided his personal life: clarity without cruelty. One afternoon, a colleague confided in him about an unhealthy relationship. The familiar story unfolded: excuses, rationalizations, hope stretched thin. Daniel didn't give advice. He asked one question instead: "What part of yourself are you sacrificing to stay?" The silence that followed told him everything. That night, Daniel returned home to an empty apartment, not lonely, just quiet. He cooked dinner, cleaned up, and stood by the window again, watching the city lights blink on one by one. He thought about how many people lived in those buildings, carrying compromises they hadn't named yet. How many stayed because leaving felt like failure? He understood now that choosing self-respect wasn't a dramatic act. It was a series of small refusals to betray yourself. Daniel didn't know exactly what the next year would bring, but he knew what it wouldn't bring. It wouldn't bring silence mistaken for peace. It wouldn't bring loyalty demanded at the expense of dignity. It wouldn't bring a version of him that shrank to keep someone else comfortable. He closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and felt grounded in a choice he continued to make every day. Not to be chosen, but to choose himself. The shift happened quietly, the way real transformations always did. There was no announcement, no sudden realization that Daniel could point to and say, "This is where everything changed." Instead, it revealed itself in the smallest moments, in how he woke up without dread, in how decisions no longer felt like negotiations with fear, in how peace stopped feeling temporary. One Saturday morning, Daniel found himself standing in the doorway of a new apartment larger than the last, filled with light, overlooking a stretch of the city he'd never lived in before. It wasn't a symbol of success or escape. It was simply the next right step. He walked from room to room slowly, imagining books on shelves, mornings with windows open, evenings that didn't feel rushed. For the first time in his adult life, he chose a home without considering how it would fit someone else's needs. Claire helped him move in the following weekend. There was laughter, minor chaos, and music playing too loudly from a speaker balanced on a box. At one point, Daniel caught her watching him from across the room, a small smile on her face. "What?" he asked. "You look settled," she said, "like you're standing on your own feet instead of bracing for something." Daniel paused, realizing she was right. He wasn't waiting anymore. Their relationship deepened, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. They built routines that belonged to both of them. Sunday breakfasts, midweek walks, quiet nights, reading side by side. When disagreements surfaced, they didn't spiral. They spoke plainly, listened fully. Discomfort no longer felt like a threat to connection. One evening, as they cooked together, Claire asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd confronted her instead of replying to that message?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I think about it less now," he said. "But I know one thing. It would have turned into noise, anger, defensiveness, nothing clear. And instead," she asked, "instead, I saw the truth without distortion," Daniel replied, "and I acted from there." That truth had continued to unfold in ways he hadn't anticipated. Months after Evan disappeared from his professional world, Daniel learned that the man had attempted to rebuild his career elsewhere, only to find doors quietly closing. Not slammed, just closed. Patterns had followed him. They always did. Daniel felt no satisfaction in it, only confirmation that accountability didn't require his involvement to exist. Rachel, too, had faded into a distant chapter. Occasionally, her name surfaced through family updates or mutual acquaintances. Therapy continued. Work restarted in a different field, far from the environment where everything had unraveled. Daniel wished her well without nostalgia. Forgiveness, he'd learned, didn't mean reopening doors. It meant locking them without resentment. At work, Daniel was offered a role that would relocate him temporarily to another city. 6 months, high visibility, career defining. A year earlier, he would have accepted without hesitation, afraid that saying no meant stagnation. Now, he weighed it carefully. That evening, he talked it through with Claire. No assumptions, no pressure. "I don't want to build a life that only looks good from the outside," he said. "I want one that feels honest when I wake up in it." Claire nodded. "Then you already know your answer." He declined the offer the next morning. Not out of fear, out of alignment. Something unexpected followed. Weeks later, his director called him in. "Your decision showed restraint," she said, And clarity, we don't see that often. She slid a folder across the desk. This is a different opportunity, one that stays rooted here. Long term. Daniel left the office with the quiet understanding that the life he was building no longer required sacrifice, disguised as ambition. One night, while organizing his new place, Daniel uncovered a small box tucked away in the back of a closet. Inside were remnants of his old life ticket stubs, a few letters, objects that once held meaning because they represented effort rather than joy. At the bottom of the box was the spare key to the old house. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Then he placed it back in the box, closed the lid, and set it aside, not for nostalgia, but for closure. Some things didn't need dramatic endings. They needed acknowledgement. As the years stretched on, Daniel found himself mentoring more people outside of work, informally, quietly, conversations over coffee, long walks where questions were asked more than answers given. He noticed a pattern in those who sought him out. They were tired, conflicted, loyal to situations that no longer honored them. He never told them what to do. He told them what he'd learned, that staying silent was still a decision, that love without respect became a debt, that dignity, once compromised, demanded interest. One evening, alone in his new apartment, Daniel stood by the window again, a habit that had followed him through every phase of his transformation. The city looked different from here, wider, less crowded. He thought about the night everything changed, how narrow his world had felt then, how small he'd believed his options were. He understood now that betrayal hadn't taken his life apart. It had removed the walls he'd mistaken for safety. Daniel turned away from the window and into the room he'd chosen, the life he'd built deliberately, step by step. There was no music playing, no voice pulling at his attention, just quiet certainty. He wasn't healed because the pain was gone. He was healed because it no longer controlled him. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come to destroy us. It comes to wake us up. Daniel's story reminds us that the deepest pain often reveals the clearest truth. Self-respect must come before comfort, and silence should never cost you your dignity. Love is not proven by how much you endure, but by how honestly you are allowed to exist. When someone chooses deception, the real choice left to us is not revenge, but clarity. Walking away isn't weakness. It's courage in its quietest form. Healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means refusing to let it define who you become. And growth doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives when you finally choose yourself, even if no one is watching. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part touched you the most? Share your feelings in the comments below. And if you're drawn to real, emotional stories about betrayal, healing, and self-worth, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one.